everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Today I'm going to show you how to install a Delta Faucet R4700-FL, a floor mount tub filler rough. Now, this rough can be mounted a few different ways depending on your situation. In this installation, we're going to be working from the top down, but you may have access to your floor from underneath, so the install will vary slightly. Also, you're going to need to sweat some copper lines for this install, so make sure you're comfortable with all of those steps or consult a professional. Typically, you'd only be tackling this project if you're doing a bathroom remodel that's been taken all the way down to the studs, or you're doing new construction. Now, if you're tackling that complicated of a project, I'm guessing you have some DIY experience. Just keep in mind that every install is unique and building codes are different everywhere. So if you run into an issue or there are any steps of the install that you're uncomfortable with, I definitely recommend bringing in a professional for some extra help. But if you feel good with it, then let's get started and talk about what tools you're going to need. Now, we're going to be using PEX for our water supplies, but you can use copper, galvanized iron, PEX, or even CPVC. Okay, grab those tools and supplies, and let's get started. Okay, so here we are in the location that I'm going to be installing my tub in my floor-mounted tub filler rough. So the first thing I need to do is determine the position of where I want the tub filler rough located. Now, there's really no rule exactly about where this needs to be placed, but there are three main considerations you want to think through when determining its final placement. Now, the first is its general location to the tub itself. Now, in my location here, I'm going to have a freestanding tub, and I want my tub filler centered off the end of the tub. So I've got a little bit of a center line here, and I'm going to locate it right at the end so it's nice and centered once everything comes together. Second, you want to think about your joists underneath your floor because we want to make sure we're installing it in an area where no joists run across it to give us plenty of room to work. Lastly, I want to think about the trim I'm going to be using at the final stage of installing my tub filler. I want to make sure it's close enough to the tub that the water is actually going to flow into my tub, but also not so close that it's going to interfere with anything else I may be installing around it or the tub itself. So once I've determined the location, I can go ahead and cut my access hole. Now that hole is going to be 2 inches deep by 2 5/8 inches wide, and I want to make sure the long side is facing the edge of my tub. What this is going to do is allow access for my plumbing connections and my mounting bolts to come up from down below the subfloor. It can be a nice spot to get a nice tight connection for my final trim. All right, so the next step we're going to do is to be applying our plate to a stringer that's going to sit down below the subfloor in between our two joists. Now, if you have an open ceiling down below, be it through a basement or just some open framing down below your bathroom that you're working in, then you don't have to cut this out because you have easy access to attach the stringer between the joists from underneath. However, in my case, I'm going to have to work from the top down since I don't have that access from underneath. So what I'm going to do here is cut a nice big hole around my joist bay, giving me plenty of room to attach that stringer to each joist. I'm going to get that cut, and then we'll come back here and I'll show you how to attach this plate to the stringer. All right, so I have my subfloor cut and removed, which is giving me great access to both sides of the joist that I'm going to be attaching my stringer in between. Once I've got that ready to go, I've cut a stringer board that's going to fit perfectly in between that joist bay there. And then you'll also notice I've cut a hole in my stringer. Now again, this is the exact same hole that was cut in the subfloor, 2 inches by 2 5/8 inches. And I've also made some reference lines on my stringer to make sure that when I'm putting this back into place, those two holes will line up perfectly with each other. Okay, once I've got that cut, I can move that off to the side and we can start talking about our mounting plate. Now the next thing we're going to be doing is attaching our mounting plate to the stringer. Now there's two ways you can do this. It's either going to sit on top of your stringer board or mount from the bottom. Now what determines this is the thickness of the floor that you're installing this on. And when I say the total thickness, I mean including the subfloor. So think about the subfloor thickness plus any underlayments plus any finished surfaces like tile or whatnot. And if all that is over 1 1/4 inches, then you want to make sure you're putting this mounting plate on top of your stringer. However, if that total thickness is under 1 1/4 inches, then that mounting plate is going to come up from the bottom of your stringer board like this. Now in my case here, I'm going to be under that 1 1/4 inch threshold, so the mounting plate is going to be attached from the bottom of my stringer like so. Now before I attach that, we want to thread in these 4 long stud screws, and they're going to go from the bottom up on these 4 holes on the inside of your mounting plate. And I'm just going to go ahead and thread them all the way through there. And I don't want to tighten them all the way down because I want them to be loose enough that I can adjust the depth from above by turning them one way or the other. So I'm going to move them all the way up, but not quite tight to the bottom of the plate. Now either way, once you get all those screwed in there, we want to make sure that we're installing our mounting plate on our stringer in the correct orientation. And that is always going to be with this indicated side facing the tub. You see there's a side and with a couple arrows here and some words that indicate which way we always want to make sure is facing the tub. So in my instance, since I'm coming from the bottom, once I get those stud screws in there, I'm going to make sure that is facing the tub, bring it up from the bottom, and then mount this in place using the 4 outer screws along the sides here. Okay, give me a chance to go ahead and put those screws into my plate, and we'll come back here and move on to the next step. Okay, so I've got all my stud screws in my mounting plate, and I just want to verify that I can turn them easily from up above, which I can. So now I'm going to be mounting my mounting plate to my stringer. And again, for my application, I'm coming from the bottom of the stringer here. So I'm going to hold the plate to the bottom of my stringer with those screws sticking up through like that. Now, to hold it in place, it's going to take 4 screws. I'm going to mount from the back side here through these outside 4 holes. Now really, any screw that's going to hold this in place will work fine, but we want to make sure we're not using a screw that's so long that it'll pass all the way through the thickness of my stringer. Now you'll notice there's a little bit of play in this plate on the hole, so I've given myself a reference line to make sure that when I screw this in place, I'm going to keep the plate as square to the tub as possible. So right there looks good. Next, I'm going to use my 4 screws and secure the plate in place. All right, we've got our mounting plate mounted to our stringer, so now we can go ahead and move on to installing our risers. Now, I think it's a good idea to go ahead and braze on our supply stubs to the bottom of the risers now, because space can get a little bit tight underneath the stringer and it'll make it a little bit easier to make those connections down the road. I also want to point out that as I'm thinking about how this is all going to come together, in my case, my supply lines are coming from the front, from the right-hand side here, so I've made one supply stub out a little bit shorter than the other. And the reason for that is once these are in place, it'll give me a little bit more space for my final plumbing connections. Now, you'll also notice that on the plate itself, there's a cold side and a hot side, and the risers are interchangeable, but we do want to make sure we remember which is which, so when we make those final plumbing connections from down below, we're getting cold to cold and hot to hot. All right, the risers come up from the bottom, and you'll see they key into a little slot on the bottom of the plate there to hold them in place at the correct height. I can go ahead and drop this down in between my joists. Now, in my instance, I'm mounting my plate from the bottom, so I want to make sure the top of my stringer is sitting even with my joists. That way my subfloor will have a nice even connection all the way side to side. However, if your mounting plate was mounting from the top, you're going to have to drop your stringer down just a little bit because we want the top of the mounting plate to be even with the bottom of the subfloor. Okay, I'm going to hold this into place. And again, I'm using my reference lines to make sure that everything's going to line up perfectly with my subfloor when I drop it back down in. And everything's looking really good here, so I'm going to use my driver, insert these 4 screws to hold my stringer in place, and then we'll be ready to move on. Okay, so now I've got my stringer in place and everything feels good and secure, we can move on to installing our test caps. Now the test caps are these 2 little gray plastic caps here that are threaded, and they'll have a black O-ring sitting at the top. Now you may have to install these O-rings, so you see I've already got installed on my right-hand side here. The left-hand side, I'm just gonna take the O-ring, slip it over the bottom of the cap, and then work it up the threads and into that channel at the top. Just keep working it down across the threads, and it will snap into the channel at the top of the cap. Okay, we've got that O-ring in there, so now we can take it, screw it into the top of our riser, and what this is going to do is give us a nice watertight seal so nothing leaks out the top. Do it to the cold side as well. Again, not over tightening these, just enough that they're nice and snug, and that looks great. So now I've got those in place, I can go ahead and make my final plumbing connections underneath with my hot and cold supply lines, and then pressurize the system. And when I do that, I'm going to be checking for any evidence of leaks of any of my connection points, because this is the time I want to correct those before moving on. If everything looks good, then we're all set to reinstall our subfloor and get on to the next step. All right, I pressure tested the system. It didn't have any leaks that need to be corrected, so now I can go ahead and drop my subfloor back down into place. Now, as I do this, I want to be very careful that I'm not damaging the riser or my screws. So I'm going to drop it straight down over that, making sure everything lines up perfectly. which it does, and it looks great. Okay, so now I can go ahead and secure my subfloor in place. All right, everything's looking great, so I can install my plaster guard now. And the way this works is it just snaps around all 4 stud screws and my risers. And then to hold it in place, I've got these 2 tabs at the top that just snap into each other. And what this is going to do is protect my rough-in valve from the other trades when they come and finish up the floors, making sure everything stays perfect for when we install our trim. Okay, once you've done that, that wraps it up for the rough install for the R4700-FL floor-mounted tub filler. All right, I hope everything went well with that install, and if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to Delta Faucet's customer service team. They're more than happy to help.